Hey, folks.
Hello.
How are you doing?
All right, how you doing? I forgot, are we using a different hack talk for these notes?
Yeah, I'll post it in the chat. I should put that in the channel or something as well.
Maybe even like cross-link the two hack docs.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It's easier to find. It sounds like we'll have a slightly smaller meeting, so I guess there's some Docker thing going on right now as well.
Some Docker thing? Is that what I heard?
That's what
Yeah.
Brendan said, so like Docker.
Oh, due to a Docker. Yeah, Docker's got the briefing for the stuff they're going to announce tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see who shows up and go from there.
It's the 16th. Is this, who's hosting this issue tough metadata on the registry?
Oh, that's me. Sorry, I should have put my name.
Okay. I just, as a side note, yesterday I completely, on the OCI call, I got completely confused between Sargon and Brandon, and I cross streams. So putting the name sometimes just a reminder to ourselves as well as others. So.
Mhm.
Did you want to just give us time to read that? Because I actually haven't caught up with this one.
Yeah, sure. It's mostly a thread, and I added the main thing I wanted to talk about was the diagram and kind of architecture design stuff. Where is the link to that? I'll post that in the chat as well. So as people join, we can get caught up on that.
I'm just reading up on Brandon's comment.
Yeah, it would be great to have Brandon on the call though.
I know, yeah, there's a couple of things in his comment I actually wanted to talk about, but yeah, we'll see how far we can get today, and then you can follow up on in a thread or something.
Yeah, actually, this is still, I haven't finished reading, but it's still the same conversation yesterday where we talked about the differentiation of tag signing versus for a sequence of updates as opposed to is that current tag still the most, is the current tag still signed by the same entity? And in most cases that would be, so there isn't any value necessarily in that case for tag signing. The tag signing this is the piece that I'm trying to tease out on where the unique value is. And unfortunately with Brandon not here, this is the second time it's come up, we can't talk about the details. So
yeah, and I think that this is actually one of the things I've been blocking on actually getting a kind of a demo up and running. I think I have all the tools kind of working and stuff, but figuring out exactly what it is that's the end that in the diagram, the artifact 1.json, like what's in that piece is kind of the blocking factor right now.
I want to probably like make sure that we don't get into the same problem that notation did if we have something working, we should probably just get it checked in the main and then iterate on something. Let's not worry about like 50 different LGTMs from everybody. I totally want to support that. The other thing is, I know this is not there on the agenda. What is the view of from a customer perspective? Do they have to install another set of tools for Tough, or will it be what's the general experience looking like? And I'm fine whatever we kind of approach as, because we should be able to tell users that you have similar experiences from how you sign it, whether it's AWS, JWT, your own custom envelope, or using Tough. And it would be great to kind of like streamline each one of them. As this is how you do sign and verify. Copy is another challenge that Brendan's talking about, but it would be great to kind of like at least get a sense of what would be the consistent story we can tell everybody. And given that we've spoken to other folks and they do want other custom algorithms implemented in some unique cases, it would be good to make sure that we can plug this into some common driver or some common pattern somehow. I don't have enough thoughts on it yet, but
yeah, what I
think,
imagine is that it would be kind of its own library. I think ideally, I think what it would basically be is a really small wrapper on top of things like GoTough and possibly also like notation or some other pieces, and just do this one piece of the puzzle, like basically try and make it as small as possible and use existing technologies as much as possible, so that this just does the putting the Tough metadata onto registries bit of the puzzle.
okay.
That would be my envisioning. And then obviously you would have dependencies on those other things. So from the client perspective, they'd also have to install those, but that should be pretty straightforward with the tool.
I mean, just to model after some other stuff that has been done in the space. I mean, if you look at the Helm work that was done, let's say Helm that exists today, it was existing is notation. The idea is that we have, and I know that there's an incubation going on, the evolvement is happening there too. And I totally agree with Sajjan. Let's get stuff in the main so you can get your hands on it and play with it. Let's not get lost in readmes and markdowns and files. I mean, the idea here is that if we can get this working to the requirements we've all set, way back in 2019, then these aren't going to be separate things. They get converged in, just like the Helm registry work is merging into the main of Helm. So this is just, we have some details we're still trying to work out. And just as we talked about the Sagrada Familia kind of modeling things, like sometimes you have to physically build something, get your hands on it to understand. And that's what we're trying to tease out here. So like we probably need to build the right extensibility points in notation. So that would be some really good feedback there. But so that you don't have to have two CLIs. Like if there's a plugin to make this work, whatever we think the delta is, I'd love to see that happen. And then as that evolves, like I said, we'll converge it and life will be good.
Yeah, because if you're looking at this kind of diagram, I think this was Brendan's kind of idea in his comment as well. Unfortunately, he's not here to correct me, but this piece on the left is kind of what I see as what notation solves. It's creating, the thing that signs the actual artifact, right? And then I think that the stuff on the right, the targets JSON, all that kind of stuff, is the stuff that I think that this piece can really focus on. And I guess creating kind of a repository that does that and a way to link this to the other repositories. I think that's the first big piece. And then there's things like the timeliness consistency, which would be like the second big piece that I see this providing.
So there's something Brandon mentions in here that I don't see in your diagram, and I'm not sure if it's captured anywhere.
Okay, sure. What is
something about NV2 sending an updated target notice to the Tough server? Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but is he implying that there's some kind of active server to do? It says it would do rebuilds and update stuff. So is he implying there's some kind of active Tough server running alongside this that is doing like the re-signing of timestamps and snapshots?
Yeah, I think that we talked about this briefly, I think at other points, especially like as we add back in the snapshot, especially piece of Tough, because basically, yeah, every time, a metadata file is updated, the snapshot file would need to be updated. And so somebody would have to do that. So I think that's what he's referring to. And I guess in this diagram, you'd still have to communicate the public key for the targets back up to the repository, but that should be way less frequent. And so, easier to manage than communicating every time there's an update. I think that's what we've done. I mean, unfortunately, he's not here, so I don't want to.
Yeah, like I think that could be done with a whole bunch of complicated client logic, or it could be done with the server that encapsulates all of that, but then that has operational complexities. So I don't think there's a clear winner. It's just, I don't see that captured, like an actual decision captured anywhere there.
Yeah, because I guess the alternative is that the client can pull the old snapshot, update, and push it. But there's some, I think that we raise conditions there that we'd have to figure out. So I would lean towards the server option, but.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, this is the part where I want to just keep on teasing out the current implementation versus the goals of what we're trying to achieve, right? Because we want to be able to capture the capabilities of what's being provided and break up maybe some of the implementation specific to so that it scales, not just, and I'm not just talking about performance scales from the volume of data. Like I know we did the spreadsheets on those deals. It's more a matter of if I have a repository with 1,000 different tags and digests in it, because customers are just automatically building everything, and there's a long history of that. And a user wants to pull an artifact or a graph of artifacts from one repo A to repo B. Doesn't matter if it's a public repo to a private. It could be promoting from their dev to their staging to their production. How do we do that in a reasonable fashion that doesn't require too much processing on the server, because we really want registries to be as dumb as possible, but still get the values of what we're trying. So that's why I keep on coming back to the requirements and trying to line those up, and then we can figure out, okay, now we know which pieces to pull out, because at the end of the day, it's just code. We can make the code do whatever we want.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two things here. I think that for the first piece, the server logic, I think that Brandon's idea specifically was to have like an external service basically that runs to do the tough snapshot timestamp stuff, and then pushes that back to the registry so that the registry itself can still be kind of a dumb storage, as we say, and not have to do any of that work automatically. And you can have non-tough images on the registry, and none of that makes a difference. I think for the other piece, I think that's why in this particular diagram, in this conversation, I'm starting with basically just the root and targets, which is basically just key distribution pieces of tough, because I think that that's in some ways the more straightforward piece. It's like it's just getting the keys for the particular images distributed with some some namespace delegations thrown in, but nothing else too complicated.
Having a sidecar server thing is both problematic because that's what we had in V1, but if it unblocks to, kind of like the same way we've said before, get stuff into bits that work, you can do a compose up, let's say, and have, distribution running alongside, some kind of NV2 server kind of thing. And let's start banging on it and get a feel for, hey, this works really well. If we shift it over here, then we don't have this problem, whatever that problem is. But I don't want to block on that being, it's something that we would obviously want to fix later on. Sometimes you pave the road with the tree in the middle or the telephone pole in the middle, and it's just obvious you have to take it out later. Let's make progress with some obvious things we want to fix.
Yeah, I think that's why like the side service I think makes sense for now. I do actually think that this is something that some registries could implement themselves if they wanted to. It's a small enough piece, but I understand that not all of them would. So I think that would be an option for the future, as like a V3 or whatever of this effort. So definitely. So any other questions on this discussion? So I think that the kind of the two big pieces are, what is it that we're signing, and what is it that we're signing? And then does this general storage mechanism and workflow seem to make sense to people? And if it does, I think I have most of the pieces I need to get a proof of concept. And so I can probably have that working by next week. So.
Signing the descriptor makes sense to me. That's the option 2 there. What would the snapshot look like? Because that's a collection of these. So would it just be like a long list of descriptors in the tough format, or would it be like a registry? Because the registry also has a way to express that using like an index.
Yeah, I think that the snapshot would only includes the tough metadata pieces. So it includes like all the targets metadata versions, basically. So I think in my current kind of thought process, there's basically one targets role per repository on the registry. And so the snapshot would just list each of those and the version numbers. But I mean, there's definitely potential for further delegations, at which point it would include more of those. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Each target itself is a descriptor, and then the snapshot is just a tough metadata collection of all of those targets. Does that make sense?
So the snapshot is basically, yes, just a piece of JSON that lists, well, in the simplest form, it's a piece of JSON that lists every single tough targets metadata file and its version number. And then there are variations for scalability, but we can talk about those later.
Right. So then for this case, so that part makes sense. That's a tough style file. But then each target here is actually like the descriptor. That's the.
Yeah. So then each so then I'm gonna share my screen so I can point with my mouse. That works better. Okay. So. Yeah, so then this artifact, this here is basically just, this piece would be signing the descriptor of the artifact. Right. Yeah, and then these ones, just these metadata files basically all just refer to each other. Yeah. This is the one that refers to an actual artifact. And the timestamp and snapshot are purposely missing from this diagram right now, because that's what the blank space here is for.
Is it possible to bundle, let's say, for example, an artifact 1, the targets and the timestamp or snapshot into one single so-called artifact or something that can be pulled down as a sidecar? Is that the proposal at this point, or?
So I think my idea right now is, yeah, this was the other thought that I wanted to talk about, actually. Thanks for bringing that up. So yeah, my kind of thought for like how the client would find all of this is that the discoverability of this like artifact1.json, the actual signature on it, would look a lot like the notation workflow, where you pull the artifact and then use the OCI reference thing to then find this one. And then to find this piece, the client already has to have the root keys distributed in a secure manner. So I figure whenever that is distributed, they can be distributed alongside the repository where you find them, where you find these metadata files. And then, because then from there you can pull the root JSON, use your known root keys to verify that, use that to then, and then pull, targets, use the keys listed in root to verify targets, and then use the keys from targets to verify the public key that's used on this JSON file itself.
So how is that dotted line represented, the targets.json over to artifact1.json?
So this dotted line, basically the targets JSON would list Rabbit Network's repository and a key. And then anything in the Rabbit Network's repository would expect to be delegated from that key, from this targets metadata.
So it's not like an OCI reference link, or?
Yeah, the reason this one's dotted is that I don't think we need or even can have an actual official reference between the two different repositories. So it would be written in this metadata, and a user could use that to reference this metadata, but it's not like an official link.
So you just have to know where the tough repository is for a given image, basically.
Yeah, that's my current kind of thinking. And that's definitely something, if other people have other ideas, I'm definitely open to those. But my current thought is that, yeah, you just have to know where the tough repository is, just like you have to know the root keys. And it should be small enough that that's okay. Or maybe it's not, I don't know. That's the question.
If we can get it working, we can always figure out how to solve the discovery problem. It's just a matter of what's the right factoring. And I added a comment to it, is that, we should be careful about not assuming that you can, when you copy something from a source to a target, you can get access to the source. Because it kind of is the whole idea, is to copy things from promoting across two registries. It could be a public registry to a private registry. It could be a DEB to prod, but the destination will be in an air-gapped environment. An air-gap is, again, not military. It's, I've got a VNet and I've blocked all external IPs. So the whole idea is that graph of content moves across, and how can that graph then be validated inside of that destination environment without caring what the source was?
Yeah, and these pieces that are on the diagram now, the root targets artifact, should be updated infrequently enough that they should work on in an air-gapped environment, as I see it. Like basically, like you could download these three files and send them to the client itself to verify using the keys that they know. That story, I think that's one of the pieces that we'll have to revisit, I think, when it comes to things like snapshot. There's actually there's some existing work going on in Uptane for a really similar problem of actually literally air-gapped cars and how they can do updates without timestamp metadata. And I imagine we can do some kind of cross-pollination of ideas to find something that works here. But again, for this first piece, I think that this stuff I think should work without internet access. Cool. Anything else here?
Get it up and running and figure out where, where
Yeah, I was hoping to get
hard edges that have to be shaved.
Yeah, I was hoping to get a demo this week. I'll definitely have something next week. At least I'll have my own tough repository with some stuff uploaded to it, and to make sure it all actually can do that. It seems to me that the tools are in a place today where I can do that piece of it without too much addition. So yeah.
Would you be able to kind of share a small write-up on what the general sequence of gets and pulls looks like? Like, say, for example, whatever your proposal is, right? Like, let's assume that the tough metadata is living in another repository or in the same repository.
Yeah.
How do you want to kind of acquire the artifact one JSON and then the targets, so forth? Can we bundle them all up as one if possible, or is it going to be separate requests? Just the basic request response flows.
Yeah, I think that it's a good question. I think that using the existing artifact spec, I think there'll at least be 2 pulls from the Rabbit Networks repository. You pull artifact 1, and then you pull the signature for it, or this, what Tough calls the targets metadata for it, which is basically the signature for it. I think those can be similar enough that we can use the same technologies to make that happen. And then on this side, I imagine there's being like a, maybe even called tough tag, we might name it something else, oops. And so you'd pull that, which would then give you the root JSON. You probably could get root and targets in the same pull request from the registry. That would make sense. Sorry, I'm thinking this through as I talk, but that makes sense to me.
That's perfect. That's the kind of, I'm hoping we can just iron this out, right? Like, say, for example, if you're one artifact, you have the pull of the image or pull of the whatever the artifact is, followed by the targets, followed by the tough metadata, and maybe this bundle would be the second bundle. And maybe it's 3 requests, but it kind of gets everything on a box as needed.
Yeah, and the other cool thing about bundling these two is that, again, if we do have those air-gapped environments, you can just kind of send that bundle over there, which is cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Basically, if you pull that, you can basically pull tough repository and you get both of those things. I don't know if that works with the current registry APIs. I'll have to play with that. That could, in my head, it could work.
The reference APIs can pull that because you basically just say these are references.
Yeah.
There's probably some detail, but that's the point of like trying it and seeing where the pieces are. Was there a focus on using index? Because I saw that referenced in to like store the targets JSON and root JSON, or did I misread the way Brandon was referring to it?
Let me reread his comment. Which part?
Well, if you don't remember it, then that's kind of like the point.
Okay.
I'm a little nervous because I wouldn't want to use index to try to reference everything in a repo, because then we have all the contention and locking, and not to mention scaling and all those problems.
Yeah,
So,
I actually think that even when we add snapshot back in, I think that keeping it separate from the registry index makes sense, because I think it means something, I think, slightly different. and probably would include less things than the entire registry index.
Maybe, but I think there's probably detail there too. What I was really kind of getting is, instead of trying to using the index manifest as, that JSON to try to have everything in it, what if you just stored it as a blob? Because you can still retrieve it. It's not like the registry is trying to do anything with parsing that manifest. And then you can still get the content. It's the reference, right? Blobs, we don't care what's in the blobs, just serve it. And then the client can do what it needs with it. So again, I'm just trying to point at some places that point away from some things that we know they're problematic, and send to places that we know are opportunistic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, my arrows, I'm thinking about this more. My arrows in this diagram might actually make sense another way too. Where the tough tag points to your current targets JSON, which then has root as a wait. Okay, any thoughts on which direction of this arrow makes sense? Because I'm questioning my previous self now about which of these you'd want to pull first and which way the reference makes sense. My thought basically is that the targets will update slightly more frequently than the root, so you probably want it to point back to the root. Or did I have that wrong?
Well, how do you verify what happens if the target's key changes?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, this is where you need the timeliness information, which is not included in this diagram. Right, because when the target's key changes, you need to be able to update the root metadata and know that you have the most up-to-date version of the root metadata that lists the most up-to-date version of the target's keys and so on. Yeah, that's the short answer is that it's not solved in this picture. Trisha, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that I don't actually know that would be solved by snapshot either, because it's the root metadata.
No, yeah, I was just thinking about it. Timestamp snapshot doesn't list the root anymore. So the first thing you're always going to need to do is at least
is update the root metadata.
Yeah, and you're going to need to know something. I think Sajay had a question related to this earlier. We're thinking of doing something similar at Datadog, which is the server knows what the client last saw. Okay, depending on what the client last saw, right? Does this make sense? And what the client is looking for, you batch everything that they need and return it in a single request.
The challenge with that, Trishank, is this is the ephemeral client requirement. One of the problems is if a client is maintaining state, that is an attack vector. So we're trying to make sure that every time a client is instanced, that it's creating a state from scratch and there is no comparison from the client.
Oh, that's also something I wanted to talk about. I just raised an issue here on Marina's meta issue, is the problem of keeping state. Clients should keep state about what they saw so they don't fall for rollback attacks. But this is a problem with containers, right? They can be nuked and restart anytime.
Yeah, that's actually
Go ahead, Marina.
That's a good one we should talk about actually, either now or later, because I do think that's an interesting question. And I think that might just have to do with, rather than the actual clients storing state, having the configuration store state, if that makes sense. And basically the configuration update to a more recent version of that state. But anyway, that I think that's an important one we should discuss. I don't know if it's here. I'll let Sajay go. I know he's raised his hand a couple times. Sorry.
Thank you. So the way I'm seeing this is the arrows are actually from a request standpoint starts with artifact 1, then goes to artifact JSON, and there might be out of band acquisition of keys as well as maybe even data about the tough. Those are things that we can have the client do. What I do want to get to is I don't think there is a problem whether we can bundle them all up as one or multiple, as long as we can define what the discovery channel is, right? Like whether it may be weather referrers or tags convention, it doesn't matter as long as we can kind of like get the client to follow through in some way and get this. And if the snapshots are kept regularly updated for timeliness, then artifact 1.json would be one way to kind of move the pointer to the latest data. So that's also a possibility. And whether we bundle them all up into one index or one, whatever kind of artifact it is something that can be done on a regular basis as well. I don't see a concern on these problems. It's just a matter of just like defining what the general flow would be. So there is some out of band data that is required. So if you can define that this is what you need to prime the client, minimum with some keys file or some expectation of policy saying that I don't accept anything that's signed before or after or some convention from a policy perspective, as well as how often will the direction from the artifact 1 to artifact 1 JSON kind of change. And those are things that might be able to define the whole timeliness story as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does. Yeah, I think alongside kind of the demo stuff that I get to start getting this working, I think it might also be nice to get like some like future API documentation written of like, this is what the future API will look like. This is what clients will have to do to interact with it. I think that would be, that sounds like it would be a great way to get a lot of this stuff figured out and answered as we also on the other side work on the code piece of it, if that makes sense. So I definitely appreciate any feedback or help there on that side of it as well, especially from people who would be interested in consuming this kind of stuff about what makes sense on that side. Yeah, does that make sense? And so yeah, I think as far as this side, it does sound like we'll have to figure out the root JSON rotation. That might again just come back to making sure that the current root is distributed to these ephemeral clients. That might be the easiest way to make that happen here. Yeah, because then we can define that the client needs to have current root JSON file and know the location of the top repository. And then from there, they should be able to access anything they want to pull using that. And I think this relationship in some ways would be needed no matter what too, because if you have more than one tough root or root in general that you trust, it would be stored in a different place. You need to know that anyway. So that's a cool bonus to this approach to storing stuff.
I'm jumping ahead a bit, but how do you see the initial root getting created the first time?
Really good question. I think it depends a little bit on who's creating it. I think that if it is a private company, private organization, they kind of have existing like an existing set of trust they can use to this create and distribute this initial root. I think for people like Docker, I think some kind of key generation and signing ceremony to create some kind of public version of that trust would be cool. We should definitely do some documentation about best practices there though. Talking about things like offline keys, etc. Because like my demo code will use all online keys and really bad best practices. So we should document somewhere how to not do that.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense because the Wabbit Networks repository is just normal. There's nothing special about it. And then this other thing can just be created from scratch and a tough root can get thrown in there before there's any kind of server validating or bootstrapping issues. I was thinking more of like, how do you push that thing into a repo? But I guess it's because they're decoupled, it should be fine.
Yeah, I think they're decoupled enough. And I think that the initial distribution of root to the client, I think should be like of these public keys especially, it should be separate anyway from you trusting it here. Like I think you shouldn't trust the root JSON because you pull it from this repository. You should trust it because you have the keys on your machine already. Yeah. Because we're not trusting the registry, but it's just storing some stuff for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the registry is not blocking any pushes or pulls or anything like that. So you don't have a weird circular dependency.
Yeah. That would actually be, that's an interesting one to threat model though. It is once we have more of this figured out is what happens if the registry blocks pushes or pulls and how that affects the
Yeah, the other one I was thinking through is like confusion, because this coupling is loose, so you could have multiple tough repositories pointing to the same actual image repository.
Yes, I think that that will come down to client, basically clear client mapping of which routes they actually want to use. And not,
Just
yeah,
whatever route you feel like using. Yeah.
yeah. Because I think there are valid reasons. I think that you'd have different routes pointing to one, and one person wants to use one of them and another person wants to use another. Like, maybe Docker has their tough repository set of keys and projects, and then somebody else decides to create their own. I could see on the same registry. I could see that happening. Yeah, basically whoever's vetting it for different things.
That's actually an interesting suggestion, or the problem that Dan is talking about. If you have multiple routes, my thinking at this point was that the first link that you have on the left, which is from the red artifact 1 to artifact JSON, will help you disambiguate which chain or which branch you want to walk down. Because and if you can kind of standardize, let's say, for example, annotations or whatever the methodology would be to discover this, right? You could potentially have artifact 1 pointing to multiple artifact 1 JSONs with different routes as well. And so that way the entire signing chain can be totally independently managed. You might have QA signing at a much higher frequency versus an entire release process signing it at a different frequency or a different set of routes altogether, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's actually a good thing. Yeah, I think there's not only one source of truth for if you should trust an image. So yeah, and you can even have the same targets point to 2 different things in here that it wants to both have signed this artifact. There's no reason not that you basically create thresholds. I think a lot of that, I think it's 4. Yeah. This is basically a really long proposal that explains this. This is, the tough version of mapping, of having different, in this case, repositories, or really what we mean is different tough routes that then point to the same potential files. This would look a little bit different, I think, in our case, but it's a similar idea. And you could have different thresholds of these pointing to it.
Yeah, I just wanted to note quickly that this would have stopped the dependency confusion attack that people were talking about recently.
Yeah, very soon I'll have a paper about that. Although I think that dependency confusion, it's a different problem in registries anyway. If not a problem, it's a different problem.
No, what I wanted to say, the map file, you could set it so that you always pull certain things from your private registry, and then everything else hits. So that gets first choice in your priority list, and then you only hit the public for all the stuff you miss in your private registry. That would have helped you there.
Yeah. And I think even, I think further than that, I think that you can use the same kind of configuration metadata to set multiple routes on the same registry that you can use. Like you can use that same format to point to specifically the tough repository on the registry.
Oh yeah, right.
When you say tough repository, are we talking about storing this in the same repository? I know that there's overloaded words, but
yeah,
wherever the artifact is that we're trying to sign, we're going to store that in the same repository as well?
No. So what I kind of envision here is that you have this Rabbit Networks or whoever it actually makes the artifact. They have their own repository, and the only piece of this kind of puzzle that they are solely responsible for is this one targets metadata file, or this one signature essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then this stuff is kind of it
Is that
could be
repository.
what's that?
Is that the stuff that's the multi-repository work?
Yeah, so I mean,
Okay.
if there is, I think, a potential for these to just be on the same repository if it's only ever talking about data in this one repository. So for things like private images, whatever, I think that there's use cases where this could be together. But I think in many cases, you want this to point to more than one, possibly a lot more than one different keys for different repositories. And most of what this does is just key management work. This
Yeah. I mean, these are the things that if we can write down, again, back to the kind of the goals and requirements, because once you span a repository, you start getting into all kinds of permission problems. Does the client have access to those multiple repositories? Are the multiple repositories spanning competing entities? I joke about the Coke and Pepsi scenarios, but it's, even within a same company, sometimes they don't want content to be shared. Even the digest, the disclosure of information is a problem. So what are the values of like, hey, within a repository, how do I ensure I've got content with the, the two key missile thing? And then there's value there. What is the use case that we're trying to solve where it crosses repositories?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Basically, the short answer is simplifying key distribution. By having this go across many different repositories, all you have to do is distribute this one set of root keys, and it can give you the keys for all of these different repositories. And you don't need to list like 100 different individual artifact keys in your configuration that you sent to the client.
But that kind of goes back to, that's the way Tough does it, as opposed to what is the requirement for what users are trying to achieve. Like
I think there's also these consistency and timeliness things. But I think really the thing you get less metadata that is sent to the user, because if they're downloading more than one thing, they can have less metadata, and less metadata stored on the registry as well, because it's a little bit centralized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we just write down what it is we're trying to achieve, like the timeliness, there's some user story around that, around what we're trying to achieve. And then the how we're trying to achieve it is, how do we try to achieve it with the concept that content is promoted? Like, how do we support that in a promoted content environment? Sorry, not environment, but the core requirements of what we're trying to achieve. Yeah, otherwise, we're just back in the same problems of Notary v1, and that's the whole point of this, right? It's like, how do we get this to scale? I mean, there was lots of usability. There's lots of
Well, this is actually one key piece that Notary v1 didn't do, was allow. It only allowed you to use it within one single repository.
Fair enough.
By separating this out, you can use it. If your organization is 2 repositories, you can point to both of your organization's repositories as the simplest case. And at the broadest case, you can have an organization like Docker that points to all of the different public ones.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So I see that maybe all Docker official images might have one, let's say, Docker Tough repository that they might sign everything and put into. And when you import something like Nginx that's officially released by Docker, can we make sure that we don't pull in the other 150 metadata pieces, because I really only care about one tag? So as long as we can scope it to, this is what I need to pull, I think that's fine, even if it's across repositories, because the clients can still work with one repository or multiple. That seems to be an easier pattern. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we want to look at that for sure. I think in this proposal, the only thing that you might pull is some extra like public keys for repositories that you're not using. But those should be small enough that it shouldn't make a difference, especially if you use like ED25519 smaller keys. Yeah, I definitely don't think you should pull the actual signature file for all the files you're not using. I think that doesn't make much sense. So we should design the API such that that doesn't happen. And I think that goes back to writing out the API design, which I think it sounds like that's something that we should do soon-ish. So I'll try and work on that in the next couple of weeks as well.
And just writing down what it is we're trying to solve. Like just again, what is the requirement pieces? I know it took us a couple of months to get those requirements written down, but that clarity around not changing I'm just using an example. I don't think it applies exactly here to answer, but the concept of writing it down and iterating over that and going, do we really want to solve that? And the reality that we wanted to preserve digests and tags is what led to the reference type work. So I don't know what the next innovation is here that we need to do, but it was instead we stopped debating solutions and we started debating like, how do we solve this problem? And that really helped make progress on it. And it's something we've been building on for 9 months now, if not more, for a year now. So what is that next thing? If we can write down what it is we're trying to solve, and then this almost fixes it.
I think a lot of this inherits from the problems that are already documented in notation from when we were doing this together. And I can copy those files to make that clear.
I think we covered the cross repo permissions thing. If not, we should. I mean, there's a couple of things that I'm trying to remember if we actually did go back and update with information around this.
So one of the cool things that cross repos actually allows, whether intentionally or not, but if you store them in a different repo, because of the permissions issue, you can actually sign third-party images and store the signatures and manage all of that in your own repository without actually kind of copying them. So like one example where this could be used, I don't think it is the new Docker feature that they have where you can like restrict which official images somebody is allowed to pull. Each organization can set their own policy for the actual upstream library images. And that's kind of an unintentional benefit that might come out of this, even though it's not really something that it was designed for. But you could go and sign like the Ubuntu image without having to copy it and let your team look for signatures in your own location.
Yeah, that's really cool. I was actually thinking about this the other way around too, which I didn't think about it that way. But if you move a signature, move an image, you can still go back to the original place to find the signature, right? You don't have to.
Yeah, it's the flip side where you can sign it without having to move the image if that's something you actually want to do.
Yeah, it kind of just basically decouples them, which has a bunch of consequences.
I actually suggest this is kind of the source of the problem. Is what we're trying to do is help users and customers not know that trying to depend on external content they don't control from a network perspective, the content perspective is hugely problematic. So I actually don't think signing something in one repo and referencing something outside of that is a kind of a practice that we want to enable or promote, helping them get the content into their environment so that they can bring the original content with the Wabbit network signature in, and then they can go like, all right, I'm happy with that, for whatever happy means, security scans, functionality, and then they can stamp it with their own signature, which they put both of those in their own registry. That is a secure, scalable, reliable solution that is exactly what we're trying to promote here. All these dependencies on some external source, whether somebody updates that content accidentally for non-intentionally bad situations, but it still breaks the world, or malicious content updates, or DNS and other things just go down for all the connections between, assuming they could even connect to it because they're all one private networks anyway. So
yeah, I think that this kind of
struggle with.
It's like flexibility at one level, which I think you could replace with some rigidity when you actually define client policies. And I think that that really does come down to good policy definitions. Because I think having these signatures that you can go back and refer to does let you say, if say a signature is revoked, maybe you still want to use this image, but it's nice to know that the person who originally signed it has revoked that signature, and you can go back and you can get that information from the centralized place where it's stored.
Yeah, but you're talking about how do you get revocations as opposed to like inside of an environment, whatever that environment is. I should have everything I need to validate that. Do I have the content? Do I have the signatures? Do I have the SBOMs? Do I have the additional signatures?
You can't possibly have the revocation information if you don't.
No, I get it.
The one that controls the key.
This is the gnarly one that we want to solve. That's what we're trying to stage them in different milestones. because it's not as simple as saying, hey, that metadata for revocations has moved over here, because if I can move it over there, how do I know I trust over here, and whatever does that mean? So I'm not trying to underestimate the problem there, but at least you're partitioning the problem, because we still, getting revocations is important, don't get me wrong, but it's more important that I can actually get the content in the first place. Because if I can't get the content, that even the content that I've already approved and blessed, like, great, I've got a signature in my environment that says I've added a signature, I trust that particular digest, but for that particular Nginx image. But if I can't get to the Nginx image because of some network configuration by design or a network failure, it's kind of a moot point. To segment it back to, hey, by the way, I've got all the content. Is that still accurate? Because the other thing is, just because it gets revoked doesn't mean I want to stop it from being used. That's an information channel. There might, because sometimes the revocation could be more, revocation for a security problem could be that security problem isn't actually a problem for that use. And taking it offline and having a business not be able to function could be more damaging. So there's just a balance there. Sajay.
Yes, Sajay, go ahead.
I see this as two problems, and one is definitely being able to discover where the original content came from, right? This is like the origin story that we have. So revocation is definitely important, because only the origin can actually publish the revocation set, if that is the truth, source of truth. I'm also seeing that Steve's point here is more about recommending having the basic scenario go within the same boundaries, between the same network boundaries, and not requiring another DNS minimum. But it doesn't mean the design or the specification should not enable a more advanced scenario of a remote pointing tough repository. That said, maybe it's just about prioritization of which to get sorted out first. And so maybe if we split this up as, hey, everything working within the same registry, same repository is what we target first. And then we can split it out as another requirement for if I wanted to get the signatures dynamically, because I might decide to deploy from Docker Hub, but given what Docker Hub has done right now, I don't think I'll ever do that. With the limits on throttling, that's definitely not a scalable solution. What is the scenarios where there would still be a third-party DNS that needs to publish these keys and sign? And we can kind of talk about that as two separate scenarios. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. And I think definitely as far as writing the code, I think that's the place to start, because it's the simplest, smallest piece, right? And we can build it out from there. That makes sense. All right, we have like 5 minutes left. Anything else here we want to talk about? Any other things that we should be focusing on or discussing in the near term for all of this?
I've just added notes to the hack doc just to make sure we don't track use. But I haven't taken everybody's notes, so feel free to just add as needed.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We can maybe take the last 5 minutes and just I'll write what we remember in there. All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Great meeting. Thanks.
Thank you.